I made a most aggravating discovery this afternoon while I was scheduling videos on this channel, and that is that I lost the footage for a video I did talking about getting The Green Knight on Blu-ray. I know a little while ago I posted a video with me ranting about physical media and the importance of physical media, the importance of film, and showing films to friends and sharing movies. That video was about Brigsby Bear, which I picked up. A movie that's about sort of the love of stories and the love of movies, or TV in that case. So I wanted to talk about The Green Knight briefly. Since I recorded that video, I went back and rewatched The Green Knight because I picked it up and decided I wanted to give it another viewing. And I really enjoyed this movie. I enjoyed when I saw it in the theater, and I enjoyed it very much when I gave it a rewatch. I put it up there with Excalibur for favorite adaptations of Arthurian mythology. You know, there are a lot. There are a few that I enjoy. There are a lot that I don't particularly enjoy. Especially a lot of the ones made in the, I think, late 40s and early 50s. It's not a time thing. I love a lot of movies from that era, but I find a lot of their historic and biblical films, that the movies that Hollywood was putting out based on mythology, history, or the Bible, specifically the Bible, were stilted and artificial in a way that I find off-putting. Not in the way that musicals were sort of artificial, sometimes stilted, but maybe in ballpark. You know, there's like, I joked before calling somebody's performance Bible acting, because they were acting in the way that people did in Hollywood Bible epics. There's a particular way that people talk. Everyone is addressing everyone as though they're giving a speech or a scolding. You know, it's a very odd style of acting that's very particular to those films. And I find that a lot of the epics and the myth movies and things like that also tend to have that. Even as much as I love them, some of the Ray Harryhausen ones have some of the similar problems, even though, again, I love most of those movies. I mean, Jason and the Argonauts is a real favorite of mine. But anyhow, I specifically wanted to talk about The Green Knight, and really Excalibur to a lesser degree, but for similar reasons. Because adaptations are a tricky thing. You're never going to make everybody happy, first off. You're just not. There are so many movies that are adaptations, comic book movies, adaptations, or things that come from plays. You know, you have like Shakespeare, and I think like ones that really change things about it. Henry V, the Kenneth Branagh version, I absolutely love. And I mean, he goes in and changes Shakespeare's text and cuts sequences out and stuff. You know, you could argue that it's like, oh, how can you mess with the perfection of the blah, blah, blah. But I think he made for a better, I mean, there's literally a speech in the end of that, the Band of Brothers speech, that in the Branagh version, it cuts at a certain point and doesn't continue where Shakespeare did continue. And honestly, listening to Shakespeare's full version of it, it guts the impact at the end. It's like you're finished with this big rousing speech and then trail off for a couple of more lines in a way that really isn't very good. Anyway, that's a side tangent. Specifically wanted to talk about movies based on properties like Le Morte d'Arthur, or, you know, to a degree the Bible, things like that. Books that are themselves subject to a great deal of interpretation, rereading, thought. They're written possibly like this one in an archaic language. There's a lot of difficulty in approaching the text, words that we don't use anymore, phrases that mean different things, you know, multiple hundred years later, it's tough to then adapt that into a movie that is going to be watchable. And that's if you just try to do a direct translation. And I would argue direct translations are they're a trap. They're a false ideal. And I say that because it's important to know that plays, short stories, novels, comic books, movies, TV shows, though they have some storytelling elements in common, they are each very different. And what works for one doesn't work for another. And that is very, very true when it comes to books into movies. You don't tell a story on film in anywhere near the way you tell a story in the book. And I would argue neither of those different ways of telling a story are superior. They are different. That's why I believe that the best adaptations tend to take the overall concept of the book and then go from that overall concept and build it up into a film. I think that's personally how it typically works. I think of the Ben Wheatley adaptation of High Rise, which has multiple scenes that are like directly taken from the book. And sure, there are some alterations here or there, mostly for padding. I mean, or not padding, but for runtime. Because, you know, even if you did somehow miraculously film the novel would probably take 10 hours to read, and you're making an hour and a half or 2 hour movie. You have to adjust. That's one thing that has to change between the written word and the film. But also, he tried really hard to do very direct sequences that are taken right out of the book. And it doesn't work as a movie. Even though I think that Ben Wheatley is a very talented director, that movie kind of fails because it's trying to hew too close to the novel without being a movie first. Okay, so that's part of my rant. I think, you know, it is very important to understand that turning a book into a movie is a real process, and expecting it to be the book that you read. And that's another important thing about the subjectivity of reading. If you read this book, it's not going to be the same book I read, even though the words are the same. But your life and your thoughts are going to change what comes from this book into your brain in a way that is different from how my brain translates those words into my brain. Does that make sense? Anyway, we each have our own version of these books. I think of my version of Frankenstein, which is very different from any film version of Frankenstein. It's probably closest to the Kenneth Branagh version, which I thought was kind of a mess. But my version of Frankenstein is not the version that you'll see in a film, because that's not how I took that novel in. So there's that. Add to that the myth cycles. It's a myth cycle, like the Bible, like your Greek text, or the text, but your Greek mythology tradition is a myth cycle. And when you interpret that, you interpret it through a lens of a specific sort of meaning. What are you trying to take from this and tell your audience? And you have Excalibur, which is a sort of a general. If I was really harsh at how I frequently talk about a lot of biopics that are done, and not a fair number of historic films, period, but certainly the biopic genre, the music biopic genre is like the worst offender, but the biopic genre of film feels like an encyclopedia entry version of it. And you could argue, like, Excalibur is kind of the encyclopedia entry version of the King Arthur myth cycle. It's the key plot points, just bing, 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 to the end. John Boorman takes that encyclopedia entry version of the story and makes a movie that is unique and special and very strange and very arch and pretty wild. And I think a really entertaining and, I say, fresh take on it, not because it does anything with the story. It's not a fresh take on the story. It's the story beats that you'll find eventually you might dig out of this book. And I think, to a degree, I think Once and Future King, perhaps. I haven't read Once and Future King yet, so I don't know how much more closely it hews to this. I don't know. But, you know, if you get your dentist tools and start really pulling teeth, you might be able to drag the story out of this book. This book is, it's beating me. I've been working on this book for 1.5 years, I think. I have to put it down for chunks of time because it's a lot. Anyway, what he did, he took elements of it and he told his own version of that story, which I think is really good. And I think that that's what The Green Knight is. The Green Knight is taking the plot points and ideas and then reworking them into a new story using these characters. And I think that's kind of what you need to do with a film based on something like, certainly like this. To a degree, I think it's something you should do anytime you adapt a novel or what have you into a film. I think of, you know, some of my favorite adaptations. I mean, the one I always point to when people talk about, oh, the book is better than the movie, the one that I usually point to argue that point is The English Patient. That novel, I don't want to be harsh or mean, but I thought it was absolute garbage. I hated the book like I can't tell you. There's barely anything to it. Reading it was like reading bad poetry. It felt like the writer was just in love with his own words and not with the characters, the story, or anything like that. It was like a dream, but a dream that sucked. And I just really didn't like that book at all. And then the movie is one of my, I think it might be in my top 10 films the last time I did a list like that, but it's certainly a film that I genuinely love. And everything I love about the film came from the writer and director of the film. Almost nothing that I liked came from the novel. You know, some of the characters are there, but they're very different. And the closest one, I think, is Kip. He's probably closest from the novel to the movie. And he's also my favorite. He's my favorite part, or my least disliked part of the novel is Kip. But, you know, anyway, the movie took elements of that novel and then made something, the writer-director made something else entirely. And what he made from that, I think, was a great film, even if the novel wasn't very good. And another one that I'll point to is Planet of the Apes. I'm not going to argue the merit of the novel. I will just say that I didn't particularly like the novel, but I like that the people behind the film took some ideas from that book, boiled them down to some basics, and then essentially told a very different story, and a story with a very different point. I feel like the novel was, and this is from my vague recollection from having read it 20 years ago, the novel was more like a satire of contemporary culture, whereas the film is I mean, it deals with a lot of stuff, but it deals with the, oppressive religious ideas, racism, all sorts of things like that. But anyhow, it's all to say that I think that The Green Knight, as I rant on, and I could go on for way longer, and I'm not going to because, good Lord. But I thought that The Green Knight was a really cool take. I think this has some amazing visuals. I think it's an awesome, fantasy film. And I like that people can take elements of books like this, focus down onto one element, and then build that element into a story that you can tell a film, from that little piece. I think that's very cool. I'd love to see more of that. What I don't want to see is just another encyclopedia entry. John Boorman made it special, but we've seen so many King Arthur films, and how many of them were very special at all? Not very many. And, there we have it. So, 2 fantasy films I really like, both inspired by a work that I am slowly working through. And yes, I know if there's a pedant in the audience, I do understand that this is not even the very first take on the myth cycle to be put into print. I understand that. This is the sort of famous one, and then the Once and Future King is the probably, from what I understand, more readable version of it for contemporary audiences. I am not a scholar of English literature. I am not a scholar particularly of Arthurian literature. I am just a person who is reading this book, likes these movies, wants to try the tabletop role-playing game from Chaosium very much, and has opinions on adapting novels and other works into film. That ramble went on. I was, like most of my videos, completely unscripted, so I probably tangent off into one way or another, and I don't know what I was trying to say. So, if you enjoy that at all, why don't you comment, or like and subscribe? Wouldn't that be lovely? But comment below. I want to hear what you think about film adaptations from novels, and what are some that you think worked? Sure, let me know. Some that you thought didn't work. And, what do you feel about changes that are made? Be they necessary or not. I can certainly think of some times when I've watched a movie, and I Am Legend with Will Smith is a prime example. The first half of that movie is such a good, true adaptation of the novel. And then Alice Braga shows up, and I love Alice Braga, she's wonderful, but in the film, she shows up, and the movie just, they threw the book out and it became something else entirely, building to an ending that, like the ending of the previous 2 film adaptations, I think was kind of a betrayal of the novel. And I say that as somebody who actually really likes The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price and absolutely loves The Omega Man with Charlton Heston. I love The Omega Man. As an adaptation of the novel, no, it's terrible. As a movie, I mean, it's kind of not great either, but I love it. It's a fun, cool, weird, ultra 70s horror action movie with all kinds of great lines and wonderful, weird performances from a whole bunch of actors. The Omega Man's fantastic. Is it a good adaptation of I Am Legend? It is not. It's closer to the gospel than it is to I Am Legend, the novel. So, anyhow, blah, 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 blah. Let me know what you think below. I'm sure somebody will think something. And, check out the links if you feel like it. Look at some of my other videos if you feel like it. This is a little different. I only barely snuck in something about tabletop RPGs near the end, but, just having fun. And physical media. Share movies with your friends. Take care.